go through Project 2025 with me so we can figure out how we're going to survive these next 4 years, hopefully only 4 of the Trump presidency. In my previous 2 videos, I talked about the first 2 promises that are in Project 2025, and so today we are talking about promise number 3 of Project 2025. So, Project number 3 states that they want to defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global powers. So I grew up in this world and with this evangelical rhetoric, and basically here they're talking about how the political woke elites have overtaken the government. They don't care about we the people of the Constitution, and we have a right to defend our borders and to be mean to whoever we want to be mean with. And so they kind of go into detail more about this throughout this first promise. And so I'm just going to go kind of step by step and explain what they're talking about, because if you don't come from this culture, it's extremely insidious and it takes your whole life to understand the lingo and what they actually mean versus what they are saying on paper. So first, they say that a nation's success derives from the character of its people. And this is super important because growing up in Christian evangelicalism, people have character or they don't. They're either good or they're evil. How are they good or have good character? Oh, I'm glad you asked. They are Christian fundamentalists. I was raised being told that children are born evil, pure evil, that everyone is disgusting rags, and that even if they're doing something good but they're not a Christian, they're doing something evil. If a non-Christian goes to help a homeless person, that's not good. They're only doing that because they want to feel good. And so it's actually selfish. And they know that giving to someone makes them feel good, and so they're selfish. But if a Christian who's been like washed as white as snow and is pure and has accepted Christ does it, then they are showing the love of God. And they're good people. So the character of its people basically means if they are Christian fundamentalists or not. And this is really specific. They have to be like a certain brand of Christianity even to be good. So that set off alarm bells for me growing up in that culture, because I know that they're saying basically we have to make America a Christian nation and it's going to be our brand of Christianity, which sucks. Next, they say that leftists have basically said that basic civics is now hate speech, and this was kind of a confusing sentence, but I think what they're trying to say is that these woke leftists won't let us say anything without us getting labeled as hate speech. And what I think they're referring here is that they have to call people by their pronouns, or that leftist people are now putting their pronouns in like their profiles, and email chains have pronouns. I think that's what they're talking to about, like basic civics and basic rights of people is hate speech. I think also they're talking about like homosexual marriage and transgender and all of that, and that they get hate speech if they talk about what they want to happen or that they hate gay people, which is interesting because it is hate speech. Basically, these Christian nationalists just want to be able to say their hate speech without any ramifications. But also, for me, I frequently go /M in the South, and so I hear people all the time saying hate speech or just like MAGA speech, and it's funny because like they feel like they can do it. So in this whole Project 2025, they're talking about how suppressed they are and how they can't say what they want to say without being labeled as hate speech. When in fact, I hear people say stuff all the time that are just like the MAGA Trump agenda, and they get to say it out in public without anyone batting an eye. So it's really just this made up thing that they're mad about. Next, they say that America's political and corporate elites have disdain for the Constitution and its people. And so they go on and on and on about how the corporate and political elites are just the worst in the whole world. And this is a very common tactic in cults. So when I was raised in Christian fundamentalism, culty Christianity, this was super common to do an us versus them. thinking, black and white thinking, like we're good, we have the truth, everyone else is bad. And so that's what they're doing with this project. They say America's political and corporate elites are bad, everything they're doing is bad, we are the only good ones. And it's interesting because they go on to say that like America's corporate elites have nothing in common with a mom on the football team in a red state, which is interesting that they use that example. When in reality, when I got out of this religion and Christian fundamentalism, I realized that everyone was living their lives the exact same. And I truly thought that Democrats were just wanting to like unalive babies all the time, and we're just mean people, and we're just horrible and the worst bosses. And then actually meeting them, I was like, oh my goodness, they're just humans. And that's what this type of rhetoric tries to get rid of, is the humanity of people and just put people in boxes of good or evil. And it's really scary reading this rhetoric throughout Project 2025 because it's just a basic cult tactic and it's really clear what they are doing. Next, they talk about how people are running programs that are bent on, or that are going to bend to the will of the woke agenda. And so this, I just think that they think all these programs are terrible and are woke and everything's woke except what they want. They go on to say, and this was interesting, they start to talk about education. And so they say intellect, education, and financial success have no bearing on a person's knowledge. This was a fascinating part, and they just go on and on and on about how like bad education is, which is super interesting. And when I grew up, in my circles, education was really looked down on. Like if you wanted to get a master's degree or a higher educational job, you were looked down on, which is like fascinating because most families would be super excited that their kids want master's degrees and stuff. But I was like dissuaded from doing any medical or lawyer or any higher educational fields because my parents were like, you don't need it, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, you should just like own a business and make money. And not that they had ill will, but it was just interesting how I can see my upbringing of like, oh yeah, and I guess it's a bigger picture of not liking education. And it's just super interesting that they say intellect and education and financial success have no bearing on a person's knowledge, which is just factually incorrect. That does have a bearing on a person's knowledge, but they like to say this, and that's because they want to get voters who do not have college degrees or higher education, because it's a proven fact that the more education you get, the more left and blue you tend to swing. And so they want to keep their voters uneducated. And so the way to keep them uneducated is to tell them you don't need education and they're just as smart and have as much knowledge as everyone else with getting just a high school degree or even getting no degree. Like education has no value and no bearing on your knowledge, which is just fascinating. But what's even more funny about this phrase and this point that they were making is when you look into the Heritage Foundation and at the beginning of Project 2025, it lists all the notable people who helped on this project, and literally so many of them went to higher education, have law degrees, some went to very, very expensive, prestigious schools. And like they're talking about how their education gave them the ability to speak on these issues. Yet they're saying you don't need education, at the same time toting their own education to get any bearing and any credit of why they can be writing this project. And so that is what these people do. They are just hypocritical. And if you look and read between the lines, you can really just see it's a cult, and they're just trying to get us versus them mentality and keep their followers uneducated and keep them from being able to hear any other side. So then they go on to talk about how they want to get rid of the EU and the United Nations, and that's nothing new. Like growing up, they've always hated the EU and the United Nations. And then they say that environmentalism is decidedly anti-human, and they don't really expound on this sentence very much. It's just kind of thrown in there of like, environmentalism is decidedly anti-human, which is, I wish they would have expounded more because I didn't understand where they got that point or anything. Then they say that environmentalists and the woke agenda are going to take away the fuels and will fuel and will not be able to have like cars or planes, which is just decidedly false. We are not going to take away the fuel, and they're basically acting like the US is going to get rid of all methods of transportation that have to do with gas and fuel, and that's just not true. Yeah, we want to lower our carbon emissions, we want to lower our fuel usage, but no one is taking away like planes, trains, and automobiles. But they're talking like that is a fact in this project, which is scary because they're just spreading false information about how people aren't going to be able to have their cars anymore. Then they talk about how TikTok is a tool for Chinese espionage, which most people know about that point that they believe. And then they go on to say, they go back to the education point, and they say that educational institutions are funded by the Chinese government, and that's why people go left after they get educated, and that any institution that has any like Chinese money or ties to China should be unaccredited, and we should have basically our own colleges with American values. And you can see this in Trump's plan. I think he literally said he was going to start some colleges, and I read before in Project 2025 how they want to have the schools be more like patriotic and get rid of like critical race theory and all of that. They just want a very pro-America educational system. And so now they're even saying, let's get rid of the colleges and put in our own pro-America colleges teaching misinformation, because that's the reason why we have all of these woke lefts. And then the last part, which was kind of the scariest part, they're like, not only is our president going to have to go on the defense from all this Chinese propaganda and educational propaganda, we have to go on the offense. And they didn't really explain exactly how they were going to do that. But for me, after reading this whole thing, I kind of took away that they are going on the offense by getting rid of, obviously, the Department of Education, getting rid of a lot of our educational programs and institutions, and basically making up their own educational system, which is terrifying, because they have said that they're going to teach education from a biased viewpoint of like Christian nationalism and pro-America. And so that is something that Germany did with making sure that the youth only heard about like pro-German propaganda. And so basically they're just going to make an educational propaganda machine, and that is terrifying.